Hey y'all, Dr. D here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a trans non-binary clinical psychologist. Weighing in here because I'm so deep in the weeds of political punditry and devastated, like so many of you, about the election results. And I'm listening to a lot of the postmortems and hearing all the theories about where we went wrong. And I think some of them have a lot more merit than others. But I'm weighing in here as a psychologist because I strongly feel that there's a big piece of the puzzle that is just missing. And it's really important. And I don't know, it brings me some weird sort of peace-ish at this time, so I just want to share it. Trauma. Trauma is such a big piece of the puzzle, and we don't understand it and we don't talk about it, and I think we need to not at all to excuse any bad behavior, certainly not to excuse misogyny, rape culture, racism, xenophobia, by no means to excuse, but to be able to understand fellow humans. We cannot get back what I truly believe to be the majority in this country who are truly want or are open to or agnostic on the idea of multiracial democracy. In order to understand enough folks to rebuild that coalition, we have to understand trauma. And I believe what moved the needle, we're not talking about millions of people, millions and millions of people. We're talking about a few million people who, some voted in the last election, chose not to vote in this one. Some switched sides, right? There's a solid, disturbingly large percentage of the population who are just truly bought into what Trump is selling, right? These are folks who are white nationalists who I have power or perceive themselves as having power or want power and believe they should have it and others shouldn't, right? This is very real. And those folks are not going to be part of a coalition that can fight fascism because they see it as meeting their needs. But I really believe there are a large number of folks who are not seeking that out. That's not what they're about. I believe trauma is a big factor. We experienced an extreme trauma that was a societal disruption like nothing in any of our lifetimes, right? We had this pandemic. Our lives were, in a matter of weeks, went from normalcy and what was expected at a time of relative economic prosperity, right? That, in my opinion, was after 8 years of a Democratic administration, right? Because we went from financial collapse through 8 years of the Obama administration. But we were in a relatively stable place. I'm not saying every aspect of everything was perfect, by no means. But we're in a relatively stable place. Yes, people voted for Trump the first time. I think we need to understand this election in some ways that are similar, that are the same or similar. But I think we have to also understand this huge trauma that happened in between as having a very different impact on this election. And also the first Trump administration as a big trauma for a lot of folks. And understand how people respond to trauma, because we, especially those of us on the left who are more politically engaged, we are thinking about things expecting a certain logic, right? That bad things happen and people want to not repeat them. And that is actually not how our brains work, especially when we're traumatized. It is not how our brains work. Our brains have you want to get jargony, a repetition compulsion, okay? Our brains want to go back and do it again and fix it. That's what a lot of our brains want to push us towards. Now, if we have the more of an extent that we have support, right? We have the privilege of having resources. We're in therapy. We are a therapist, right? We have or had some relative financial stability. The more we have sort of the privilege to be able to logic our way out of that repetition compulsion. But as a society, there are folks who are, I believe, are caught up in this wanting to fix it by like having a do-over. We're gonna do it again, and this time it's not gonna end traumatically. And that's how we're gonna fix our trauma. Okay, so that's one piece of it. Another piece of it, so a series of traumas happen. The pandemic is the biggest and the most far-reaching. We lost 1 million people. Okay, none of us knew who those people would end up being. If it would end up being us, if it would end up being our loved ones. For a lot of us, it was our loved ones, right? George Floyd was a trauma and part of an ongoing trauma that's been since the beginning of our nation, right? But that was an extremely triggering time. Since 2016, there have been tremendous and frightening attacks on marginalized communities. There was a Muslim ban. There were ICE officers coming into our communities, taking our neighbors. That happened in my town. And it was extremely traumatizing. We saw our Black neighbors and community members in a string of violent attacks by police, state-sanctioned killings, most of which were not, justice was not served. The LGBTQ community, for a lot of us, including our very vulnerable youth, under just constant, unrelenting attack, right? So I know a lot of you are listening to this and you're like, yeah, that was all awful. Why would people want to go back to that? Especially some of the groups who were targeted, right? So we have to understand what the brain does when we experience trauma. So one big piece, dissociation. Again, you don't need to know the jargon. The point is, our brains want to split things off and push them away to protect us. If you imagine a very simple situation where we're under threat, right? Before we were at the top of the food chain, we're walking around in the woods, gathering food. We hear something in the bushes. We have to go into a fight or flight. We have to run from a predator. If every time now we go into the woods to gather food, we're going into a fight or flight, remembering that, we're going to starve, right? So our brain takes the trauma. I was chased. It was frightening. I thought I was going to be killed. Cuts it off and puts it in a drawer in our brain, right? In a closed drawer. It's an attempt for our brain to protect us. But the dark side of that, the downside of that, is that we can then not remember, right? And we see a tremendous amount of this, right? People have dissociated the traumatic part. So they remember when the economy was better. They remember when things were more stable before the trauma happened, or the series of traumas, or before some of the traumas, right? And then things get real fuzzy. And I think we demonize people who are affected more so by these trauma symptoms at our own peril, right? Because these are folks who are potential allies. Many of these are folks who are probably more traumatized because they were targeted in the first administration, because they were essential workers, right? Because they lost more family members during the pandemic, because their livelihood was more at risk, and perhaps has been since. And they are impacted by inflation, and these things are real. And as a society, we are experiencing collective dissociation. This is just factual. If you ask people how things were, they don't remember, right? And we can factually know how things were. We can even know how we said they were at the time. Donald Trump had a 40% approval rating, right? His approval rating has been higher this past year than it ever was at any time during his presidency. I don't think it's useful to read that as people in the interim decided that they agree with a lot of his racism, demonization, all of those things, right? Misogyny. That just isn't a scientific explanation of what happened. Are there people who agree with those things? 1000%, and we need to hold those people accountable. We can be very angry, disappointed, disillusioned, bereft that other people weren't in a mental place to vote against those things. And listen, I'm a trans person, I'm a queer person, I have queer children. I can be profoundly enraged, and I understand those sentiments. I really do. But again, I think it's to our own detriment if we begin to see so many of our neighbors and community members as people who have like intentionally bought in to the hatefulness, right? Another really key piece of this: when people are traumatized, our brains take in and take on a trauma paradigm, right? Our brains begin to function as if we are under duress and we're in a traumatic situation, and they get stuck. Again, as a way to survive. So it's like, again, we're in the woods and we're being chased by a predator, and the opposite, and both of these things can be true at the same time, right? But the opposite response from the dissociation is, now I believe I'm in that threat situation all the time. And everybody is either a predator or a prey now. Because that's what my brain got stuck in, right? Everybody's a predator or a prey. Because that's how it was during the trauma. If that's the way you're functioning, and again, understand these things I'm talking about are not conscious. And I want to say, because I don't want to sound like I am pathologizing people who are experiencing these things. I have my own quite extensive trauma history, and I've done a lot of my own trauma work, and I have all of these symptoms myself. I have dealt with plenty of dissociation. I have, for a lot of my life, fallen into these patterns of seeing people as victim and predator, victim and aggressor, right? So I am not above, and that's where I think I'm finding a store of empathy for people who are in these kinds of states of mind and not consciously aware of it. So they're not saying, I'm dealing with this by identifying with an aggressor, right? But I believe that they are identifying with an aggressor. And if you think about it, it's actually really profoundly logical. If your brain is telling you, I'm in a traumatic paradigm, the world is broken up into predator and prey. Everyone is either a victim or an aggressor. Identification with an aggressor is a really logical response. It's not an ideal response, because the truth, the fact, the science is that the world is not broken up into aggressors and victims, perpetrators and victims, right? The truth is much more gray than that. Most people have times when we're victimized, times when we may be mistreating people, but most of us, the majority of the time, are not falling into either of those categories, right? There are people who are significant perpetrators, and there are people who really are being significantly victimized. But that's not all there is. That's not all there is to human interaction, right? But when a whole society experiences a trauma on top of lots of other traumas that just happened recently, some of which have been happening for forever, but this clusterfuck, right, for lack of a better term, of traumas, losses, rocking of the foundation of anything that we could ever have expected or predicted. We have a whole society that's falling into this kind of thinking at a time when the leader who is in power has already primed us to see the world in this us or them way, right? A leader has already primed us. I'm the only one who can fix it, he's telling us, right? Those people, those others are the problem. And I'm going to fix it. And either you're with me or you're against me. We're primed, right? We're already in that. And then this pandemic happens. And our minds are going to. The only outcome here is that I'm a victim or I'm a perpetrator. And here's a big bully who has tremendous power. He's the president of the United States. He takes no prisoners. He orchestrates a violent coup on our government, right? If your brain is telling you the only paths for you are victim or aggressor, you're gonna have a lot of people who, in a way, very logically gravitate toward the aggressor. It's called identification with the aggressor. And it is, in a way, a healthy response to trauma. If you think about a child who's living in a home with a violent perpetrator and a person who's being victimized repeatedly, we would want that child, in the absence of a third way, of understanding there's another way to be, right? We would want that child to identify with the aggressor. As problematic as that is, that's their best ticket out of there. That's the way some of us have gotten out alive. Honestly, right? By feeling like we have power because we're identifying with someone who has power. And sometimes that's the only thing that makes us feel like we have any power. It is highly problematic, and I am not excusing folks for this or saying that it's good. I'm saying it is understandable psychologically, and it is psychologically a wildly different phenomenon than someone who identifies with Trump or likes him because they agree with him. Okay? So if you imagine that child living in an abusive household, right? It's not that the child agrees with the perpetrator. She's not saying, I agree that my parent threatens and attacks my other parent. But she might be saying, I can be powerful like that, and then I won't be beaten and attacked. That's a really important distinction. Because if we assume 52-53% of the population fully in their most adult, right, grounded mind is condoning, is signing on for viciousness, racism, rape culture, misogyny, transphobia, all kinds of hateful, racist, xenophobic, putting people in camps, torturing transgender kids, right? I don't know how, I can't live like that. there are already enough folks who are signing on for that. And there are a lot of folks. There are millions of folks who are signing on for that, truly. We need to be clear-eyed about that, but it's not 53%. And I don't believe that, and I don't believe the research, I don't believe the science bears that out. I think these folks, many of them are traumatized, and they are dissociated. So they don't remember legitimately, right? Not purposefully, not a conscious, I'm not going to remember. Their brains, to try to protect them, are not remembering. They really don't remember the first Trump term. Not that they've blocked it out, not that they don't remember it at all, but it's fuzzy. It's fuzzy for a lot of us. Second thing, identification with the aggressor. I feel powerless. I feel under threat. I feel traumatized. My brain, to try to protect me, is telling me this powerful person, if I hitch my cart to this powerful person, I can get out, right? It's not logical if you are grounded and you can take a step out of the trauma. But if you're in the trauma, if you're in the soup, it has a logic. Third thing, regression. When we're in a traumatized state, when we're frightened, when we feel under threat, we go back to what we know, right? And that also gets at that fourth thing, which is the repetition compulsion. Our brain wants to do it again until we get it right. This time it's going to be different. This time he's going to be different. He didn't mean all those things. He didn't mean all those things he said. Yeah, maybe there are people he hates, but not me. He's really going to help me. Repetition compulsion. This time it's going to go better. Trauma response. And the third, regression. Let's say more a little bit about that. We go back to what we know, right? Even if it's harmful, even if it's abusive. And the more traumatized we feel, the more our brain wants to go back to what we know. The devil I know, right? Are there people for whom who just won't vote for a black woman? Absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. I don't think the numbers and the science bears out that was as big a factor as these pieces of trauma, as these psychological phenomenon. And I think you can understand them on an individual level, right? With some of the groups who were most traumatized. And I think you can understand it at a societal level, that we're regressing, right? Meaning, and again, you don't need to know the jargon. The point is, as a people, we're frightened. Something traumatic happens and our instinct is to go back, right? Make America Great Again is a regression slogan. That's what it is. It's regression. Let's go back to what we know. Things are scary. Even if I was oppressed in what I know and what I'm used to, my brain still wants to go back. And if you think about people who are in abusive relationships, who have been even in abusive work situations, whose brains got used to abusive dynamics. This is what so many of us do. We repeat We go back to what we know because it's comfortable in the sense of being known, right? This is the devil I know. And the more scared we are, the more we're not able to move towards something new. We're not able to get out of the trauma paradigm. Even if, by all logic and all facts, we're way better off outside of the trauma dynamic, right? A extremely qualified candidate is offering us something that is unquestionably going to be better for us and where we're going to be treated better. But our brain can't recognize that when our nervous system is in a traumatized state. We literally can't recognize it. Does not register. Because all we know at that point is perpetrator and victim. And if your brain is looking for a perpetrator, my friends, Donald Trump will fit the bill. So understand, this is a vicious cycle where we're getting more traumatized, and then because we're traumatized as a society, we're trying to go back. We're trying to go back to what we know. We're trying to identify with people who are perceived as powerful. Trump, Elon Musk, etc., etc. There are many other factors that impacted this election. I do not at all mean to suggest that this is it, but this is the one no one's talking about. And this is the one I believe that can help us come toward our neighbors who are in that middle group, okay? Not the folks who were marching in Charlottesville, not the folks who are like all in for white nationalism. This is not what I'm talking about. The diehard MAGA folks, we're not engaging with them. It's not safe. It's not safe, and it's not a good use of time. But there's a huge chunk of folks here who are also in some ways just less aware of what's going on, and that's a whole other issue, right? But who are in a traumatized state of mind, and we need to approach them with that understanding. We need to approach them with compassion, and we need to not assume that they are not allies. Okay? My ally isn't going to be able to show themselves to be an ally if their nervous system has been in a fight or flight for 4, 8, etc. years on and off. But that doesn't mean they're not my ally. And we're not going to get out of this without psychology. Politics is not enough on its own here. And there's a lot of political post-mortem to do here. There's a lot of things to think about in terms of the politics. But if we don't understand the psychology, we're not gonna be able to get these folks back. We need to offer them we need to start from a place of understanding their trauma and frankly our own. And from a place of how do we stop replicating the trauma, right? So that we can come together against these other folks who really are fascist, right? Who really are buying into the the fascist agenda that's being offered, because in their clear-headed right minds, that is what they want. Hoping to say more about this as time goes on.